The airport terminal buzzed with the low hum of frustrated conversations and the occasional overhead announcement. I sank into a worn plastic chair, my patience wearing thin as the minutes ticked by. My daughter Zoe sat beside me, her face glued to her tablet. We were supposed to be on our way home by now, but our flight had been delayed for the better part of 2 hours. Across from us, an elderly man shuffled along with a noticeable limp. His gait was slow and deliberate, each step seeming to be a struggle. He carried a weathered carry-on bag that looked as though it had seen many miles. I couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to command a certain respect, despite his obvious discomfort. The man made his way to his seat, but as he navigated the narrow aisle, his carry-on inadvertently brushed against the shoulder of a wealthy-looking passenger. This man was dressed in a sharply tailored suit and had a scowl etched on his face, as if he was perpetually displeased with the world around him. The wealthy passenger's voice cut through the din of the terminal. "Watch where you're going, old man. Your bag just hit me." The elderly man paused, clearly taken aback. He turned, his face a mask of apology, but the wealthy passenger's disdain was palpable. "I'm very sorry, sir. It was an accident." The wealthy passenger snorted, his expression sour. "And what's that smell? I didn't pay for a premium seat just to have to deal with this." I watched as the elderly man's face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to adjust his bag and settle into his seat, but it was clear the situation had shaken him. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a small, defeated sigh. Zoe looked up from her tablet, her eyes wide with concern. "Mom, that's really unfair. He didn't do it on purpose." I nodded, feeling a surge of anger on behalf of the elderly man. I stood up, my resolve firm. As I approached the wealthy passenger, I could feel the eyes of other travelers on me. The wealth of his appearance contrasted sharply with the man's suffering, making the injustice even more glaring. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my tone measured. I couldn't help but overhear. "I think it's important to remember that we're all human here. He didn't mean to hit you." The wealthy passenger raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by my confrontation. "And what's it to you?" "It's about basic decency," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. "He's an elderly man, and he's clearly having a tough time. A little kindness wouldn't hurt." The wealthy passenger huffed, clearly uninterested in any further discussion. "Whatever. I'm just saying, it's unpleasant." I turned back to the elderly man, who was now trying to make himself more comfortable in his seat. "Sir, if you'd like, I can switch seats with you. There's an empty spot further back that might be more comfortable." The elderly man looked up at me, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, miss. That's very kind of you." We made the seat swap, and as I settled into my new spot, I glanced back to see the elderly man looking visibly relieved. His face held a faint, appreciative smile. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing I had done something to alleviate his discomfort. Zoe leaned over and whispered, "You did a good thing, Mom." I smiled at her, feeling a mixture of pride and hope. Even in moments of frustration and negativity, there was still room for compassion and understanding. The flight delay had dragged on, and the once bustling terminal had quieted to a low murmur. Zoe and I were now seated farther back in the cabin, having swapped places with the elderly man, George, to give him a bit more comfort. I hoped that the brief interaction would be enough to ease his distress, but the sting of the wealthy passenger's harsh comments lingered in my mind. Just as I was beginning to relax, a commotion erupted a few rows ahead. I could see George struggling to get his carry-on into the overhead bin, his hands trembling slightly. The wealthy passenger, now settled into his seat, muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Can't believe this flight. First, I'm assaulted by an old man's bag, and now I have to listen to his groans. This is unacceptable." I caught George's eyes as he struggled with the bin, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. The wealthy passenger's comments were clearly getting under his skin. My irritation flared up again. I stood up, determined to confront the situation head-on. I approached the wealthy passenger, my face set in a firm but calm expression. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the cabin. "I need to ask you to please be more considerate." He turned to me, his expression one of surprise and annoyance. "And why should I?" "Because respect costs nothing," I replied. "The man you're referring to is struggling. He's already had a tough time today. There's no need to be rude." The wealthy passenger's eyes narrowed, his annoyance turning into hostility. "I paid for my seat. I expect a certain level of comfort and respect. And he's not worth respecting." I asked, my tone more pointed. "He's a human being just like the rest of us. Sometimes it's important to remember that." He scoffed and turned away, muttering under his breath, "This is ridiculous." I didn't let it deter me. I walked back to George, who had finally managed to stow his bag. He looked up at me with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked gently. George nodded, a small, appreciative smile on his face. "Yes, thank you. It's just been a rough day." Zoe, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up from her seat. "I think people should just be nicer to each other, don't you think?" George chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "You're absolutely right, young lady." I took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the confrontation ease. I noticed a few passengers glancing our way, some with expressions of approval. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift slightly, as if the confrontation had sparked a moment of reflection. Just then, the flight attendant came down the aisle, her gaze softening as she noticed the tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone polite and concerned. I nodded. "Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure this gentleman was comfortable." The attendant gave me a nod of approval and continued on her way. I returned to my seat, feeling a mix of satisfaction and lingering frustration. Zoe gave me a small smile, clearly proud of the stand I had taken. "You did the right thing, Mom," she said, her voice filled with admiration. I smiled back, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Sometimes, standing up for what's right wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. As I settled into my seat, I glanced over at George, who had now settled comfortably, his earlier distress replaced with a look of quiet contentment. The plane finally began its descent, and the once restless cabin quieted down. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I watched George settle into his seat with a newfound calm. Zoe, having been quiet through most of the flight, finally nudged me. "Mom, I think he wants to talk to us," Zoe said softly, nodding toward George, who had turned slightly in his seat, his gaze fixed on us. I nodded and gestured for George to go ahead. "Is there something you need, sir?" George cleared his throat, his voice a bit hoarse but steady. "Actually, I'd like to thank you both for your kindness earlier. It means a lot to me." I smiled warmly. It was the least we could do. No one should have to face that kind of treatment. George gave a nod of appreciation. "I'm George, by the way. I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you both local?" "We're from here," I replied. "I'm Ella, and this is my daughter Zoe. We live just a bit outside the city." George's eyes softened, and he seemed to consider something for a moment before speaking again. "You know, I don't often share my story with strangers, but I feel like you both have shown me such respect. I'd like to tell you a bit about myself." Zoe leaned forward, her curiosity evident. "We'd love to hear it, Mr. George." George took a deep breath and began. "I'm a veteran, you see. I served in World War II and a Korean War, the limp you see. It's from a bullet wound I took back in the day. I lost a lot in those wars, and it's been a long road since." My heart ached for him. "That sounds incredibly difficult. Thank you for your service, George. It must have been a lot to carry." George nodded, his expression becoming more reflective. "It was. I lost a dear friend in the Korean War. His name was Henry. We were close, and he saved my life more times than I can count. After the war, we lost touch, and I never had the chance to thank him properly. Zoe looked at George with wide eyes. That's really touching. I'm sure he would have been proud to know how much he meant to you. George smiled sadly. I hope so. He was a good man. It's strange, but sometimes I feel like life has a way of bringing people together again, even after so many years. I felt a pang of recognition. My grandfather, Henry, had always been a humble man, never one to boast about his wartime heroics. Could this be the same Henry? George, I said slowly, do you know if Henry is still around? George shook his head. I lost track of him a long time ago. I've tried to find him over the years, but never had any luck. A sudden thought struck me. My grandfather's name is Henry. Could it be? George's eyes widened with surprise. Really? What are the chances? I nodded, my heart racing. Yes, my grandfather was also in the Korean War. He never spoke much about it, but he did mention a close friend named George who saved his life. George's face lit up with hope and excitement. Could it be? I have to meet him. It's been so long, and to know he's been close all this time. I turned to Zoe, feeling a rush of emotion. I think we need to arrange a reunion. Zoe's eyes sparkled with excitement. That would be amazing. Let's make it happen, Mom. George's eyes were misty, but he nodded gratefully. I would be forever thankful if you could arrange that. It would mean the world to me. As the plane landed, and we prepared to disembark, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The chance to reconnect George with my grandfather was a gift I didn't expect, but one that I knew would be incredibly meaningful for both of them. The car ride home from the airport was filled with a mix of anticipation and contemplation. Zoe and I exchanged glances, both excited and a little apprehensive about what we had discovered. George, sitting in the back seat, seemed lost in thought, his gaze occasionally drifting out the window. When we arrived at our modest family home, I invited George inside, eager to continue our conversation. As we entered, Zoe ran off to make some tea, while I guided George to the living room. Please, make yourself comfortable, I said, gesturing to the couch. I'll just get some refreshments. George settled into the couch, his gaze scanning the room with a blend of curiosity and nostalgia. I returned with a tray of tea and snacks, and we began to chat more casually. George, I said as I handed him a cup of tea, I've been thinking about what you shared on the flight. It's really struck a chord with me. George smiled warmly. I appreciate that, Ella. It's not often I get to talk about those days. Zoe joined us, holding a cup of tea. Grandpa always said the war changed him, but he never went into details. I think he'd like to hear your story. George looked thoughtful. The wars did change many of us. It's not just the battles. It's the people we meet, the bonds we form. I nodded, setting down my cup. I've been thinking more about your friend Henry. It's uncanny, but my grandfather was in the Korean War too. He was always so quiet about it. George's eyes widened in excitement. Could it be the same Henry? What's his last name? I hesitated for a moment, then said, his last name is Thompson. A look of recognition crossed George's face. Henry Thompson. That's him. I knew he had a family, but I never knew what became of him. Zoe's eyes lit up. That's incredible. Grandpa always spoke fondly of his friends. We should call him right away. I grabbed my phone, dialed the number I had for my grandfather, and waited as it rang. Hi, Grandpa, it's Ella, I said when he answered. I have someone here who wants to speak with you. Can you talk? There was a brief pause on the other end. Sure, Ella. What's going on? I handed the phone to George, who took a deep breath before speaking. Henry. It's George. George Miller. Do you remember me? There was a moment of stunned silence on the line before my grandfather's voice broke through, filled with emotion. George, is that really you? After all these years, George's voice was thick with emotion as he replied, Yes, it's me. I've been trying to find you. I'm here with Ella and Zoe, and it seems your granddaughter and I crossed paths in a rather unexpected way. The conversation continued with George and Henry exchanging stories, their voices filled with nostalgia and joy. Zoe and I watched, both amazed and touched by the emotional reunion. After George ended the call, he looked at me with a tearful smile. "Thank you, Ella. I never thought I'd have the chance to reconnect with Henry. This means more to me than I can express." Zoe hugged George. "I'm so glad you two found each other again." I nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment. It's amazing how life works out sometimes. I'm glad we could be a part of this. George's eyes were misty as he thanked us once again. It's not just about reconnecting with an old friend. It's about the kindness and support I found in you both. I'm deeply grateful. As we settled in for the evening, the house felt warmer and more connected. The reunion between George and my grandfather had added a new layer of significance to our lives, reminding us of the power of friendship, family, and the unexpected turns that bring people together. The following weekend, I arranged for George to visit our home again, this time with the hope of facilitating a reunion with my grandfather, Henry. I could hardly contain my excitement as I prepared for the visit, ensuring everything was perfect for this heartfelt occasion. The doorbell rang promptly at 2 p.m., and I opened it to find George standing there with a small, hopeful smile. He was dressed neatly in a button-down shirt and slacks, looking both nervous and excited. "Come in, George," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Grandpa will be here soon. Please, make yourself comfortable." George nodded gratefully and took a seat in the living room. Zoe and I exchanged knowing glances as we set up the coffee table with refreshments. As we were preparing, the doorbell rang again. I opened it to reveal my grandfather, Henry, looking slightly frazzled but eager. "Hello, Grandpa." I greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming." Henry gave me a quick hug and then looked past me into the living room. "Where's this old friend of yours?" "He's in the living room," I said, guiding him towards the room. "I think you'll be very happy to see him." Henry walked in slowly, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on George. His face broke into a mixture of shock and joy. "George Miller." George stood up, his eyes shining. "Henry Thompson, it's really you." The two men stood frozen for a moment before they embraced, their hugs tight and filled with emotion. Henry's voice was choked with tears as he spoke. "I can't believe it. It's been so long. How are you, old friend?" George's voice was equally emotional. "I'm doing well, Henry. But seeing you here, this is more than I ever hoped for." Zoe and I watched, our hearts warmed by the touching reunion. I could see the weight of years of separation lifting from their shoulders as they sat down together, their hands clasped tightly. Henry wiped his eyes and looked at George. "I never thought I'd see you again. You saved my life back in Korea. I've carried that with me all these years." George shook his head, a smile on his face. "You saved mine, too. I always remembered your bravery and friendship. It's a miracle we found each other." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and nostalgia. "You've been on my mind often. I've tried to reach out, but life just got in the way." I cleared my throat gently, drawing their attention. "George, Grandpa, would you like some coffee or tea while you catch up?" "Tea would be lovely," George replied, still visibly moved. Henry agreed, and I went to prepare the beverages. When I returned, I found the two men deep in conversation, exchanging stories and reminiscing about their experiences in the war. "I remember that night in the foxhole," Henry was saying. "You were the one who kept us going, George. I was so scared." George laughed softly. "And you kept the spirits high with your jokes, even when things looked bleak. I think that's what kept us all sane." Their conversation flowed seamlessly, filled with laughter and shared memories. It was clear that their bond was as strong as ever, despite the years that had passed. Zoe, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Grandpa, Mom told me about your time in the war. I never realized how many lives you touched. Henry looked at Zoe with a gentle smile. It's the friends we make and the bonds we form that really matter. I'm glad I got to share this time with George. George nodded, his eyes reflecting his own appreciation. I couldn't agree more. Meeting Henry again has reminded me of the strength of friendship and the power of shared experiences. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation continued to flow effortlessly, with George and Henry exchanging more personal stories and heartfelt memories. By the end of the visit, it was clear that the reunion had brought immense joy and healing to both men. As Henry prepared to leave, he turned to George with a tearful smile. I'm so glad we found each other again. Let's make sure we stay in touch this time. George nodded, his eyes misty. Absolutely. And thank you, Ella and Zoe, for making this possible. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It was our pleasure. Seeing you two reconnect has been truly wonderful. With heartfelt goodbyes and promises to keep in touch, Henry left our home, and George stayed a little longer to help us clean up. As we finished, George turned to me with a grateful expression. I can't thank you enough for this, Ella. It means more to me than you know. I smiled warmly. I'm just glad we could help. Seeing you and Henry together again is more than I could have hoped for. As George left, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that the bonds of friendship and family have been strengthened through our small act of kindness. The evening after George's reunion with Henry was filled with a sense of tranquility. The warmth of the day lingered as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light across the living room, where George and Henry continued to share stories. I invited them to stay for dinner, and both men accepted, eager to savor more time together. As we gathered around the dining table, Henry and George were animatedly discussing their shared experiences. The atmosphere was light and full of laughter, punctuated by moments of reflection and nostalgia. Henry poured himself a glass of wine and raised it. To old friends and new beginnings, he said with a grin. Here's to the memories we've shared, and to making new ones. George clinked his glass against Henry's, his eyes twinkling. And to the bravery and camaraderie that made those memories possible. Cheers. Ella, ever the gracious host, had prepared a hearty meal of roasted chicken, vegetables, and a homemade apple pie. As we dug in, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the bond between Henry and George remained palpable. I watched as George took a bite of the pie and sighed contentedly. Ella, this is fantastic. You've outdone yourself. Thank you, George, I replied with a smile. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I thought it might be nice to have a bit of home comfort after such a meaningful reunion. Henry looked at George with a thoughtful expression. You know, George, I've often wondered about the paths our lives took after the war. We've lost touch with so many people we served with. George nodded, his expression reflective. I've thought about that too. I often wonder how they're doing, where they ended up. It's remarkable to think that after all these years, we found each other. The conversation turned to more personal stories. Henry shared a memory from his childhood, describing how he had built a small treehouse with his father. George listened intently, chuckling, and adding his own anecdotes. I remember when I was a kid, George said, leaning forward, my father used to take me to the lake every summer. We'd fish and camp out under the stars. Those were some of the best times of my life. Henry's eyes lit up. Sounds wonderful. I had a similar experience with my grandfather. He'd take me to the countryside, and we'd spend hours exploring and learning about nature. Ella, who had been quietly observing, interjected with a soft smile. It's incredible how these simple moments from our past shape who we are. It's like they stay with us, guiding us through life. George nodded in agreement. Absolutely. Those moments give us strength when times are tough. As the evening progressed, Henry and George continued to reminisce, sharing stories of their families, their adventures, and the challenges they faced after the war. Each story seemed to bridge the gap between the past and the present, bringing them closer together. Eventually, the conversation turned to more somber topics. Henry's eyes grew serious as he spoke. "George, do you ever think about the friends we lost?" "I think about them often." George's expression softened. "Yes, I do. It's hard not to. We lost some great men, and their sacrifices are something I'll always remember." Henry placed a reassuring hand on George's shoulder. "We've been fortunate to have lived as long as we have, and to have had the chance to reconnect. I'm grateful for that." George nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "I am too. It's moments like these that remind me of the value of friendship and the importance of cherishing the time we have." As the night drew to a close, Henry and George exchanged heartfelt goodbyes. They'd promised to stay in touch and to make more time for each other in the future. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching them leave, knowing that their reunion had not only rekindled their friendship, but had also brought them healing. In the quiet that followed, Zoe joined me in the kitchen, where we were cleaning up. She looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you think George and Grandpa will keep in touch?" "I hope so," I replied, placing a dish in the sink. "Their friendship means a lot to both of them. I believe they'll find ways to stay connected." Zoe smiled. "I think it's really special how you helped them reconnect. It's like you gave them a piece of their past back." I nodded, feeling a warm glow of contentment. "It was my pleasure, Zoe. It's wonderful to see old friends finding each other again and finding peace in their shared memories." As I looked out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade away, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The healing and reconnection that had taken place were more profound than I could have imagined, leaving me with a renewed appreciation for the bonds we form and the ways in which they enrich our lives. The days following George and Henry's reunion were filled with a gentle sense of peace and satisfaction. Their friendship had been rekindled in a way that seemed almost magical, as if time itself had woven their lives back together. The bond they shared was a testament to the enduring power of camaraderie and the deep emotional connections forged through shared experiences. One crisp morning, I awoke to find George and Henry in the living room, engaged in an animated conversation. The warmth of the sun streaming through the windows highlighted the contented expressions on their faces. I could tell that their time together had been profoundly healing. As I joined them for breakfast, the table was filled with laughter and stories. Zoe was sitting between them, clearly fascinated by the tales they were sharing. I set down a plate of freshly baked croissants and sat down, eager to hear more. "So George," I said, pouring coffee into my mug, "how have you been finding your time here with us?" George smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling. "It's been wonderful, Ella. I'm so grateful for your hospitality. It's not often that I get to relive such cherished memories with an old friend." Henry, reaching for a croissant, added with a chuckle, "And it's been a pleasure having you here, George. I didn't realize how much I missed these conversations until we started talking again." Zoe, her eyes wide with curiosity, asked, "What was the most memorable moment you two shared during the war?" Henry took a thoughtful sip of his coffee before responding. "There were so many moments, but one that stands out was when George saved my life during a particularly intense battle. We were under heavy fire, and George, despite being injured, dragged me to safety. I owe him more than I can ever repay." George's face grew solemn as he nodded. "It was a close call. We were lucky to make it out of that one. But it wasn't just about saving lives. It was about having each other's backs when it mattered most." Zoe looked at them with admiration. "It's incredible how brave you both were. I can't imagine what it was like." Henry placed a hand on Zoe's shoulder. "We were just doing what needed to be done. It was our duty, but it was also about the bond we formed. That bond has lasted all these years." As breakfast drew to a close, I noticed George and Henry sharing a quiet moment on the porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the landscape. I could see that their time together had brought them a sense of closure and fulfillment. I joined them, and George turned to me with a heartfelt expression. "Ella, I want to thank you for everything. Without your kindness, I don't know if I would have had the chance to reconnect with Henry. I smiled, touched by his words. It was my pleasure, George. I'm glad I could help bring you back together. It's been an honor to witness the renewal of your friendship. Henry nodded in agreement. Absolutely. It's been a blessing to be reminded of the value of true friendship. It's something we often take for granted until it's gone. George looked out over the horizon, his gaze thoughtful. You know, I think the best part of all this is knowing that we still have each other. Even after all these years and the hardships we faced, our bond remained strong. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, George and Henry shared a quiet moment of reflection. They spoke of their hopes for the future and the importance of staying connected with those who matter most. I watched them with a sense of contentment, feeling a deep appreciation for the unexpected journey that had brought us all together. It was clear that the reunion had not only rekindled old friendships, but had also provided a sense of healing and closure that would stay with them for years to come. As the evening drew to a close, I hugged both men tightly, feeling a profound gratitude for the connections we had forged. Thank you for being a part of this, George and Henry. I'll always cherish the memories we've made together. George smiled warmly, his eyes glistening with emotion. And I'll cherish the new memories we've created. It's been a true blessing. Henry added, here's to many more years of friendship and the continued joy of sharing our lives with each other. With that, the night settled in, and we bid farewell to George and Henry, knowing that their renewed friendship was a testament to the enduring power of human connection. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that the bonds we form have the power to heal, inspire, and bring joy to our lives.